I want to start at the exact moment everything changed, because it didn't happen the way you'd expect. There was no moonlight, no sudden confession across a candlelit table. It happened on a Sunday afternoon in October, under a flickering overhead light that had needed a new bulb for 6 weeks, in a kitchen that smelled like eucalyptus and dried flowers and the particular quiet of a day winding down. I was sitting at her table holding 4 pages of printed paper, reading a love letter out loud, and I was somewhere near the bottom of the 3rd page when I stopped. Not because I forgot the words, because I understood them. I read the same line 3 times and felt something move through me that I can only describe as recognition. The kind that settles into your chest like a key finding the right lock, slow and certain and final. The man she had spent 4 weeks describing. The one she had chosen every word for. The one she had agonized over and rewritten and whispered about in my kitchen over bad coffee and the soft light of early evenings. I lowered the pages. I looked up at her. She was already looking at me. And I understood, completely, irreversibly, in a way I could not unknow, that the man in that letter was me. That it had always been me, and that I had been sitting across from her this whole time, helping her find the sentences for feelings I already shared, without either of us saying a single word about it out loud. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back 3 weeks. Let me take you back to the Tuesday evening when she knocked on my door with flour on her shirt and a look on her face like she'd just made a decision she couldn't unmake. My name is Nathan Wells. I'm 32 years old and I work from a small apartment in a building that groans when the heat comes on in November and smells perpetually of someone else's cooking. I'm a freelance copywriter. My job, reduced to its simplest form, is to take what someone means and turn it into what they should have said. I write website copy, brand voice guides, product descriptions, the kind of language that sits just below conscious thought and makes you feel a certain way without knowing why. I'm good at it. Not because I'm naturally expressive, I'm actually the opposite of that. I'm the kind of person who would rather edit a feeling than speak it. I would rather find the perfect sentence than say the imperfect one. I've been told this is both my greatest professional skill and my most inconvenient personal flaw, and I've never seriously argued with either assessment. I've lived in this building for 4 years. For the last 3 of those years, the apartment directly across the hall from mine has belonged to Sophie Carmichael. Sophie arrived on a Saturday in early October with more boxes than one person should own, a succulent that somehow survived the move in perfect condition, and a gray sweatshirt from a university she had never actually attended. I know this because she told me, with complete ease, while we stood in the hallway and I held one end of a box she couldn't quite manage alone. She said she'd bought the sweatshirt at a thrift store because the color was right, and she'd never once regretted it. That sentence told me more about Sophie Carmichael than any introduction could have. She makes decisions by feel. She doesn't second-guess what already seems right. She moves through the world with a kind of uncomplicated warmth that people in certain tax brackets pay therapists to help them find. And Sophie just has it, naturally, the way some people have green eyes or a sense of direction. She works as a florist at a small shop called Clover and Stem, 6 blocks from our building. She leaves at 6:45 every morning, and I hear her door close because our hallway has the acoustics of a library. Every sound travels, perfectly preserved. Some mornings she knocks on mine on the way out and hands me a flower. Not as a gesture, she would insist, just because she brings home the leftovers and her apartment can only hold so many. Over 3 years I've received carnations, ranunculus, baby's breath, dried lavender, a single long-stemmed tulip she handed me with the deadpan seriousness of a pharmacist handing over a prescription. I keep the small cards she tucks in with them, the ones with her handwriting, which is terrible in a very charming way, all angles and no curves. I haven't told her I keep them. It felt like too much to admit. For 3 years we have been the kind of friends that people on the outside always assume are something more. They see us at dinner and ask how long we've been together. They see her fixing my collar at a work function and nudge each other. We correct them every time, and it's true every time, and the correction has never once felt easy, but I've gotten very practiced at making it sound like it is. She is my closest friend. She is the person who knows which version of me is performing and which one is actually there. She is the only person I've allowed inside a sentence before I've finished writing it, which for me is not a small thing. She reads my work and tells me when I'm being too polished, when the voice is clean but cold, when I'm hiding behind structure instead of saying something true. She is, in the language of my own profession, the person who edits me, and I have been in love with her for probably 18 months without doing anything about it, which should tell you something about the gap between knowing the right word and having the courage to say it. She knocked on my door on a Tuesday in mid-October at 7 in the evening. She was still wearing her work clothes, a dark green apron over a striped shirt, and there was flour on the apron because she'd apparently stopped at the bakery on her way home, which she sometimes did when she was thinking hard about something and needed something to do with her hands. She looked at me and said, immediately, without preamble, "I need your help with something, and I need you to not make it weird." I told her I had never made anything weird in my life, which was such an obvious lie that she laughed before she finished crossing my threshold. She sat down in the kitchen chair she'd long since claimed as hers, the one closest to the window, the one that wobbles slightly on the left side because I keep meaning to fix it and never do. And she put her phone face down on the table and said, "I want to write a letter, an actual letter, on paper." I asked her who to. She looked at the table. She said, "Someone." Just that. Someone. I want to tell you that something in me shifted when she said that. Some antenna went up. But the truth is I just nodded and pulled my laptop over and opened a new document and said, "Okay, what do you want to say?" I didn't ask for a name because she hadn't offered one, and Sophie, when she's not ready to say something, holds it close and you wait. You just wait. That's one of the things I understand about her that most people don't. She doesn't withhold to be mysterious. She withholds because she needs to trust an idea before she can let it out into the air. So I waited. She was quiet for a long time. Long enough that I made myself coffee I didn't particularly want, just to give the silence somewhere to go. Then she said, "I want to say that I've been thinking about him for a long time without having a word for it." I typed that. She nodded. I asked what else. She looked at the window. It was dark outside, the city doing its quiet Sunday evening thing, and she said, "I want to say that he makes the ordinary parts feel different, not because he does anything dramatic, just because he's present, in a way I've started to depend on without noticing." I typed it. She leaned forward. She said, "Is that too vague?" I read it back to her. I said it was exactly right. She said, "Okay, keep going." That's how the first session went. An hour, maybe a little more, building the opening of something careful and true. She would give me half a thought and I would find the sentence it was trying to be, and she would lean forward and say, "Yes, that's it," the way she always does when something lands, like she's been searching for a shape and I've just handed it to her. I'm good at that, finding the sentence inside the half-thought. It's what I do for a living. But doing it for her that night was different from doing it for a brand or a client brief. It felt less like editing and more like excavating something that had been waiting to be found. By the time she closed the laptop and said she should go, we had 3 paragraphs. She looked at them and she said quietly, "I didn't know I could say it like this." I told her she'd said it. I'd just arranged it. She shook her head and said that wasn't true, but she was smiling when she said it, and I let it go. She came back Wednesday and Thursday. The following Tuesday. We developed a rhythm without discussing it. She'd arrive around 6 or 7, settle into her chair, make coffee in my kitchen because she claimed my coffee maker ran quieter than hers, which I had never noticed but somehow made complete sense. She'd bring the draft up on the laptop and we'd read through what we had and then move forward, adding to it, adjusting things, finding the better version of sentences she'd been turning over in her head between sessions. I never asked his name. I kept telling myself it wasn't my place. I kept telling myself she'd offer it when she was ready. But I think the truth, the honest truth, the one I was avoiding, is that I didn't ask because some quiet part of me had started paying very close attention to the details she was offering. And that part of me wasn't sure it wanted to know the name. The details started accumulating on the second session. She said he smelled like coffee and something faintly wooden, like cedar or clean sawdust. I happened to burn a cedar candle when I worked, had done so for years. I noted it and filed it under coincidence. She said he was the kind of person who fixed things before you asked him to. She mentioned almost offhandedly that her bathroom cabinet had stopped closing properly, and the next time she'd looked it was perfectly hung. I had fixed that cabinet 3 months ago. I'd noticed the hinge one evening when she'd left the door open and I'd had the right screwdriver on me. I'd told myself it was a small thing, the kind of thing you did for someone whose apartment you spent time in. I put that detail in the coincidence column too and tried not to look at it too directly. The third session brought something I almost couldn't dismiss. She was sitting with her feet tucked up under her the way she always sat when she was thinking hard, and she said, "I want to write about the way he listens." She stopped. The room was quiet. I waited. She said, "When I'm talking to him, I feel like what I'm saying is actually landing somewhere, like it's going into a real place instead of just dissipating." She looked at the table. "Is that strange?" I said it wasn't strange. She said, "I want to write it, but I want to get it right." She took the laptop from me and typed it herself, slowly, one careful phrase at a time, reading it back under her breath as she went. When she turned the screen toward me, I read, "He makes me feel like the things I say are worth keeping, not because he always responds with the right thing, because he receives them. There's a difference." I read that sentence twice. I looked up. She was watching me with her chin on her hand, that specific look she has when she's waiting to see if something is right. I said, "Don't change a word." She said, "You're sure?" I said, "I'm certain. Leave it exactly as it is." And I turned back to the screen and we kept going, and I told myself very firmly that I was projecting, that a person who listened well was not automatically me, that plenty of people listened well, that I needed to get myself under control. But here is the thing about trying not to notice something. The more you instruct yourself not to look at it, the more it occupies exactly the space you are trying to protect. By the fourth session, I was doing a constant quiet accounting in my head, each new detail either landing on the side of "it's not him" or "it could be him," and the columns were becoming seriously unequal. The cedar smell, the cabinet, the quality of attention she described, the fact that she came to me, of all people, of all the friends she had, to help her find the words, the fact that she always chose my kitchen, my chair, my evenings. And then, in the middle of the fourth session, she said something that almost gave me an escape route. She mentioned, casually, in the middle of a longer description, that he had a particular habit of tilting his head slightly to the left when he was working through a problem. She said it was the thing she'd noticed first about him, before anything else. I sat very still. I thought, I don't do that. I have no idea if I do that. I don't tilt my head. I don't think I tilt my head. I felt a specific, shameful rush of relief. It's not me. She's describing someone else. There are men in the world who tilt their heads to the left and listen well and smell like cedar and fix cabinets without being asked. And that man is not me. That is just a coincidence of overlapping qualities, and I need to stop doing this to myself immediately. I typed what she said about the head tilt with what felt like the first clean breath I'd taken in 2 weeks. I told myself we were fine. I told myself I was going home to be a normal person who helps his friend write a letter for someone who is not him. That clarity lasted 4 days. 4 days during which I slept normally and ate properly and did not spend 45 minutes staring at the ceiling at 1 in the morning cataloging every interaction I'd had with Sophie in the past 6 months. 4 days during which I genuinely believed I had been catastrophically overthinking a situation that was not actually about me and felt slightly embarrassed at how deep into my own head I had allowed myself to go. 4 days. And then she showed up on a Saturday morning, unannounced, with the draft on her phone and a look on her face like she'd been writing all night. She sat down and said, "I added something. I wrote it at 2 in the morning and I don't know if it's too much." She pulled up the paragraph on her phone and read it to me, not looking up, voice low and steady. "I've been afraid to say this because I don't know how he feels. I've been afraid that what I feel is one-sided, and that naming it will break something I've come to depend on. and that losing the ordinary version of what we have might hurt more than never knowing what the other version could be. She stopped. She looked up. She said, "Is it too honest?" I said it wasn't. I said it was the truest thing in the letter. She said, "It's the part I've been avoiding writing." I said I knew. She said, "How did you know?" I said, "Because it took you 4 sessions to get there, and you haven't been slow about any of the other parts." She smiled. A real one, not the performance smile she keeps in front for people she doesn't trust. She said, "You know me too well," and I said, "Not too well, just well." And something moved between us in the quiet of that, something I felt very clearly and did not act on, because I had learned absolutely nothing from the previous 3 weeks apparently. Or because I was still not certain. Or because I was a person who could identify the right sentence and still be unable to say it. I need to tell you about the head tilt. Because 4 days after my false relief, I was sitting at my own desk trying to work on a product brief when I noticed something. I have a habit, I've apparently always had it, I just didn't know, of tilting my head slightly to the left when I'm rereading something I'm not sure about yet. I noticed it because I caught my own reflection in the dark screen when the monitor went to sleep and I saw myself doing it, head tilted, considering. I sat there for a long moment. I thought, of course. I thought, you absolute coward, you knew. And I closed the laptop, and I made tea I didn't drink, and I sat at the kitchen table for the better part of an hour just being honest with myself in a way I should have been weeks earlier. I was in love with her. I had been in love with her for long enough that I couldn't pinpoint the start of it, only the moment it had become impossible to pretend otherwise. And she was writing me a letter, and handing me the pieces of it, and asking me to make it beautiful. And I had been doing exactly that, and neither of us had said a single true thing yet. The night before she came to read it aloud, I didn't sleep well. I lay in bed and thought about what would happen if I was wrong. If the cedar smell was a coincidence, and the cabinet was a coincidence, and the listening and the ordinary Tuesday evenings and the way she'd held my gaze a half-second, too long that one night, and the sentence about the ordinary version of being with him, if all of it was coincidence and the letter was for someone else and I had been building an entire architecture of meaning out of nothing, I thought about having to sit across from her while she sent this letter to someone else and smile about it. And I thought about how that was not actually impossible. I had been doing difficult things in silence for 18 months. I could do this too. I could be a person who took the loss cleanly and said nothing and kept being her friend. I told myself that was the most likely outcome and I needed to be ready for it. Then I got up and made coffee at 4 in the morning and stood at the window watching the city be quiet and thought, but what if I'm right? She arrived at 2 on Sunday with the pages already printed. That detail, the printing, stopped me. She had printed it. On the good cream paper, the thick kind. She'd held the pages together with a small fold in the corner instead of a paper clip, which was so specifically Sophie that it made my chest hurt a little. She sat down and she set the pages on the table between us and she said, "I want you to read the whole thing out loud. I need to hear how it sounds when it's all together." I looked at the pages. She looked at me. I picked them up. The first page I read with something close to professional detachment. I was reading my own sentences back, the ones I'd drafted, the ones that had come from her and that I'd given shape to. And they were good, they were true to her, and I read them with care but without falling apart. The second page was harder. The second page was the paragraph about how he made her feel known without having to hand him an explanation, and the one about the ordinary evenings, the bad coffee, and the nothing conversations that felt like everything from where she sat. My voice stayed level. It cost me something to keep it level. The third page was the paragraph she'd brought at 2 in the morning, the one about being afraid of naming it and losing what they had. I read it slowly. My throat tightened on the last line and I took a breath before I continued. And then I turned to the fourth page. The last one, a page I hadn't seen before. I want to tell you what it said. I have read it probably 100 times since. The words are not going anywhere. It said, "I've waited a long time to say this because I have been afraid of being wrong about you, but I've been sitting across from you for weeks now, handing you the pieces of how I feel, and watching you find the sentences inside them, and I've realized something that I should have understood a long time ago. You already know this letter. Not because I explained it to you, because every word in it is something you've already been in practice without a name for it. You've been what I was trying to describe before I had the language, and I think you deserve to know that. Even if it changes everything, even if I'm wrong, I'd rather be wrong out loud than right in silence for the rest of whatever this is. I stopped reading. The room was very quiet. Outside, something, a bus, a distant car, moved past the window. The overhead light hummed softly, the way it always did when it was close to needing a new bulb. Sophie hadn't moved. She was in her chair, feet on the floor for once, coffee mug in both hands, looking at me with an expression I didn't have a word for yet, but that I now know to call the look of someone who has just set something very heavy down and is waiting to find out if the ground will hold it. I said her name. She said, "Keep reading." I said, "There's nothing else on the page." She said, "I know." I put the pages down on the table. I set them flat, carefully, the way you set something down that you want to keep. And I looked at her, and I stopped doing the thing I had been doing for weeks, which was managing what I let myself understand. I let myself understand all of it, every session, every detail she'd handed me. The cedar smell, the cabinet, the way she described being listened to, the ordinary Tuesday evenings she'd said she wanted with him, the 2 in the morning paragraph about being afraid to name it, the head tilt I hadn't known about until I saw my own reflection, the way she'd always come here, to my kitchen, my chair, my evenings, the way she'd held my gaze that one time and looked down before I could respond to it. I let all of it in at once, and it didn't feel like revelation. It felt like finally reading something I'd been holding at arm's length and discovering it already made sense. I said, "Sophie, is this letter about me?" She looked at me. Her voice was very quiet and very steady. She said, "I wasn't sure you'd notice." I sat there for a moment with that sentence. I wasn't sure you'd notice. Not, I didn't know if you felt the same. Not, I wasn't sure how you'd react. I wasn't sure you'd notice. Like the possibility had existed all along that I might read this whole letter, out loud in her voice, and simply not put myself in it. Like she'd written me 4 pages about myself, and the risk was that I'd hand them back and say, "He sounds like a wonderful person, I hope it works out." I said, "I noticed." She exhaled. It was a slow, careful exhale, the kind you do when you've been holding something in your chest for a very long time. She set the coffee mug down. She looked at her hands. She said, "I had a backup plan, for if you didn't." I asked what it was. She said, "I was going to say I was sending it to someone I met at a flower show. I had a whole name ready. I made it up 3 days ago, and I've been anxious about it ever since because it was a very unconvincing name." I almost laughed. I said, "What was the name?" She said it didn't matter, and also it was slightly embarrassing and she'd like to retire it now that it was no longer needed. And then I did laugh, actually laughed, and she laughed too, and for a moment we were just ourselves, the same 2 people who had been eating takeout on this floor and was arguing about film endings and talking at 7 in the morning and passing flowers across a hallway for 3 years. Except now something that had been folded up tight between us was finally open and lying flat on the table where we could both look at it. I reached across and took her hand. Her fingers were cool from the coffee mug, and they curled around mine without hesitation, the way you reach for something you already know the shape of. I said, "I should have written you a letter." She said, "You would have over-edited it. Too many precise verbs. It would have read like a very well-crafted brand manifesto." I said that was probably accurate. She said, "I needed it to come from me. In my words, even when they were wrong." I said, "They weren't wrong." She said, "The best half of them are yours." I said, "The best half is the part you wrote at 2 in the morning when you were too tired to be careful." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That's the part I've been trying to write for a year." I said, "I know." She looked at me. She said, "How long have you known?" I said, "I started suspecting around the 2nd session." She said, "And you kept helping me write it anyway." I said, "You needed the sentences and I had them." She shook her head slowly, smiling. The specific smile that lives in just the left corner of her mouth and means she thinks I'm being willfully understated. She was right, as usual. What I meant was, I would have helped her write anything. I would have sat in that chair for as long as she needed. Because being useful to her, being the person she came to with the half-formed thing she needed help carrying, was the closest I had allowed myself to get, and it had been enough, mostly, until it wasn't anymore. We ordered dinner from the Thai place she'd been calling every Friday for 2 years, and ate it at the kitchen table with the wobbly leg, and talked for a long time about things that were both ordinary and not ordinary at all. She told me she'd been afraid I would figure out the letter was about me halfway through a session and quietly excuse myself and never say why. I told her I'd been afraid of the opposite, of assuming it was about me and being catastrophically, humiliatingly wrong. She said, "How would you have survived that?" I thought about it seriously. I said, "I would not have." She said, "Good. Now you don't have to find out." I said, "Now I don't have to find out." She ate a piece of tofu and looked at me and said, "You know what the worst part was?" I said, "What?" She said, "I had to sit there while you found the most beautiful sentences for how I felt about you, and I couldn't say, 'Nathan, that's you, you're doing this to yourself.'" I said, "Why didn't you?" She said, "Because if you hadn't noticed, I would have had to live with that. And at least this way the letter could exist even if you didn't." I thought about that for a long moment. I thought about what it meant that she had been willing to write the truest thing she'd ever put on paper and hand it to the subject of it and risk everything on whether he'd recognize himself. I thought about the specific kind of courage that required. I thought about the gap between her courage and mine, and felt something close to embarrassed gratitude that she'd been brave enough for both of us. After dinner, she picked up the printed pages and read through them once more, quietly, to herself. I watched her face move through the words she'd spent a month building. When she reached the last paragraph, she went still for a moment. Then she looked up and said, "I think it's the best thing I've ever written." I said I agreed. She said, "Even the parts you wrote." I said, "Especially the parts I wrote," because finding her sentences was the closest I'd come to understanding her completely, and I'd meant every word. She folded the pages along their original crease and set them on the table between us. She said, "I'm not going to send it." I said, "I know." She said, "The person it was for is already here." I said, "He noticed, eventually." She looked at me for a long second, and then she smiled. Not the left corner smile this time, but the full one, the rare one, the one she has when she's not managing anything, and I thought, there it is. There is the reason I sat in that chair for 4 weeks and found every sentence she needed and did not say a word, because if this was the end of it, if this is where it was always going, then every session was exactly what it was supposed to be. That was 9 months ago. The letter lives in the top drawer of her nightstand now. She told me this without my asking one morning. The way you mention something important you want the other person to know is being kept. The kitchen table still has a wobbly leg. She asked me to leave it because she's gotten used to it and change would be unsettling. Her door still closes at 6:45, and sometimes I'm in the hall when it does, and we walk the first few blocks together before she turns toward Clover and Stem and I turn back. Some mornings she still hands me a flower on the way. She still doesn't call it romantic. I still keep every one. The cards too, with her terrible angled handwriting. She knows now that I keep them. The first time I told her, she stared at me for a long moment, and then she said, "Nathan, that's very sweet and also slightly alarming." And I said I understood, and she said she wanted to see them, and I showed her, and she got very quiet while she looked through them, and then she put them back carefully and said, "I've been writing you love notes for 3 years and neither of us knew." I said I knew now. She said, "What do you want to do with that information?" I said, "Keep going." She said, "Yeah." She tucked the cards back into the small box where I kept them and left them on my shelf where they've always been. I think about those 4 weeks a lot. I think about what it meant that she designed it the way she did, came to me with the unformed thing, and let me shape it without telling me it was mine. She could have handed me the finished letter. She could have slid it under my door one night and let me read it alone. She could have said any of it directly, in plain language, without the sessions and the drafts and the careful accumulation of detail. But Sophie had known me for 3 years. She knew how I worked. She knew that I understood things best when I arrived at them through language, when I could hold a sentence and turn it and find what was true inside it. She had given me 4 weeks of her feelings in pieces and let me put them together myself, because she trusted that if she handed me enough of the right words I would eventually read my own name in them. She was right. She was also, it turns out, very patient. Far more patient than I deserved. If you have ever loved someone from a short distance and said nothing because the distance felt safe and what you had felt like enough, if you've ever sat across from someone and helped them carry something that was actually about you and told yourself it wasn't because naming it felt like too much of a risk, you know the particular kind of loneliness that lives in that space. You know the math of it, the daily adding up of small moments and telling yourself they don't equal what they look like. You know what it costs to be fluent in someone else's feelings and still not speak your own. And you know the relief of finally being understood. Not because you found the courage to say the thing, but because someone who knew you well enough reached into the silence and found the sentence for you, and handed it back, and waited to see if you recognized yourself in it. Sophie found the sentence. She handed it to me 4 pages at a time, and I was slow, genuinely, embarrassingly slow. But I got there, and some love stories start with a grand gesture or a perfect moment, or exactly the right words said at exactly the right time. Ours started with a woman who couldn't say it out loud, asking the man she loved to help her write it down, trusting that he would eventually understand what she was handing him. It took him 4 weeks and a cedar candle and a head tilt he didn't know he had. But he got there, he noticed. He put the pages down and looked up and said her name, and she said keep reading, and he said there's nothing else on the page, and she said I know. And from there, everything else followed. She asked me to help write her love letter. She didn't tell me it was about me. She trusted me to figure it out. And I think, looking back at the man I was before that Tuesday evening, the man who had the right sentences for everything and could not say the one true thing, I think that was exactly the right way to reach me. Through the words, through the work, through the patient accumulation of everything I already recognized as mine. I was the last person to know, and I think I was always supposed to be.